Hello and thank you for taking the time out to join this special CNBC Africa conversation. Today we'll get some updates on developments around the African Continental Free Trade Area. I'm Kenneth Igbomo, so let's get into the details. At their 7th meeting in Accra earlier this month, trade ministers across Africa reaffirmed their commitment to commence trade under the African Continental Free Trade Area. Although outstanding issues around the rules of origin remain, Africa's trade ministers believe that the implementation of the Continental Trade Pact will go a long way to help countries overcome the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And have with me today Wamkele Mene, the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. He joins me now to bring us up to speed on developments around intra-Africa trade. Thank you so much for your time today, sir. Let's first start by taking stock from where we left off from our last conversation, starting with the area of ratifications. On our last conversation, you said that we could expect about 40 countries to be on board as at July. Where are we at right now with ratifications?
Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me to participate and share knowledge with you and your viewers. We are now at 41 countries that have ratified the agreement establishing the AfCFTA. The last time we spoke, I had predicted that we would be at 40 countries. I was off by one country. We are now at 41 countries, which is very, very encouraging indeed, because it means that more and more African countries, more and more governments, private sector, civil society recognize the importance of reducing and eliminating barriers to intra-Africa trade. So it certainly is a very, very encouraging development indeed.
All right, now still following up on developments, you also mentioned the target to raise $1 billion for a trade finance facility to support women and small businesses. How is that coming along?
It's moving slowly. It's moving relatively slowly. The big challenge that we have is all our partners, the commercial banks, as much as they have the liquidity, many of them have trade finance portfolios, but what is required is how we are going to mitigate the risk. So the risk factor for a continent-wide trade finance facility is the big challenge that we are negotiating at the moment. As a matter of fact, just this morning here in Abidjan, in Côte d'Ivoire, I had a meeting with one of the leading commercial banks on the continent, and we were discussing this very same issue of how we are going to mitigate the risk when banks make available these large sums of money for trade finance, which is very, very important. And so we are working hard. We're pushing on. I had hoped that by now we would have resolved this issue, but it is something that is very, very important for the banks to have comfort insofar as risk mitigation is concerned, whether it is by way of providing sovereign guarantees. We will find a way. It's just that it is taking longer than I had expected at this point. But it is an important endeavor, because I believe that the only way for the AfCFTA to be distinguishable from any other trade agreement around the world, and certainly even on the continent, is the provision of trade finance to enable small, medium enterprises, primarily those that are led by young entrepreneurs and by women, to enable them to access the entire AfCFTA market. If you are in Southern Africa, the trade finance facility should enable you to access the market in East Africa and West Africa, and vice versa, and other parts of the continent.
No doubt, the trade finance is also the part of the lifeblood of a trade pact of this scale. But now let's get into the area of payments. Yes, we've seen the Pan-African payment and settlement system come on board, but what has the reception been like from the businesses across from the continent?
The Pan-African payments and settlement system is now being piloted in 6 countries in West Africa. As you know, we as the AfCFTA Secretariat are providing the legal framework, the legal anchor within the African Union system for the payment system to take off. And of course, AfCFTA is providing the liquidity over $1 billion for the settlements to be done, as well as providing the technology that is required for payments to happen in an instantaneous manner, as well as efficiently and in an affordable manner. Today, 42 currencies, and we discussed this the last time I was on your show, we have over 42 currencies in Africa, and that the currency convertibility, when you are seeking to trade with your counterparty in another part of the continent, or indeed in countries that are next to each other. Ghana, next door to Cote d'Ivoire, uses the Ghanaian cedi. Here in Cote d'Ivoire, they use the CFA franc. The cost of currency convertibility, we estimate is at about $5 billion annually. This is costing Africa's economy a significant amount of money. And so we need to take drastic action. It has been now 30, 40 years since we have been talking about this challenge. And so ourselves, the AfCFTA Secretariat, as well as AfCFTA, with AfCFTA taking the lead on this, we want to move beyond just the speeches and talking. We want to address this question with specificity. We need to take drastic action. $5 billion revenue forgone of Africa's economy is a significant amount of money. There are also other costs to Africa's economy, the cost to efficiency, affordability, and the constraint to boosting intra-Africa trade. All of these factors contribute are attributable to this challenge of the cost of currency convertibility. And so I believe that the Pan-African payments and settlement system is not the silver bullet that we could have in a single currency on the African continent. However, in the absence of a single currency, this is the best option that we have. I should also hasten to add that we are not foreclosing on any other payments and settlement system that anybody else, a private player, a bank, a fintech may wish to introduce in the market. Absolutely, we are not. All we are doing is to say we have a specific challenge now. AfCFTA has provided the liquidity over $1 billion. Let's do something about it. We're not going to be able to boost intra-Africa trade as long as we have this challenge of the cost of currency convertibility. And we so far have seen very positive results from the 6 countries where the Pan-African payments and settlement system is being piloted. And we hope that as we enter the new year, more and more countries will switch onto the platform. We are in discussions with central banks in order to provide the necessary comfort to central banks about issues related to interoperability, for example, of the Pan-African payment system with existing payment systems in the regions. And so we are making very, very significant progress, and I'm very encouraged about the support that we are receiving throughout the African continent.
All right, I hope we'll move away from the pilot phase soon, though. But moving on to other external developments, let's get some of the details of the memorandum of understanding that you signed with the China Ministry of Commerce and what that will mean for the trade pact, the African Continental Free Trade Area.
We have been negotiating this memorandum of understanding with the government of the People's Republic of China for the last 2 to 3 months. The memorandum of understanding is within the scope and within the framework of an existing broader cooperation arrangement between the African Union, of which, as you know, we are an organ, and the People's Republic of China. And so there is a pre-existing legal framework between the African Union and the People's Republic of China. but this one is more specific. What we have done is we have negotiated an arrangement that is more specific on trade and investment relations between the AfCFTA Secretariat and China. And some of the areas, the scope of this MOU, it includes intellectual property rights, cooperation on intellectual property rights, cooperation on investment protection, competition policy, customs procedures, sharing of expertise and information in these different areas is very, very important. And then, of course, what we agreed to do is that as we in the last month before FOCAC, that the trade and investment dimension of FOCAC will now be enhanced by this memorandum of understanding that we have signed with the People's Republic of China. And so we expect that the benefits to the AfCFTA market and the AfCFTA Secretariat in particular will be enhanced investment by China into AfCFTA markets, particularly in the area of productive sectors, in manufacturing, where job creation is required the most, and of course, in other areas such as digital trade. So it is a step that we are taking to solidify an already existing relationship within the context of the African Union and China's cooperation.
All right, it's very good that you mentioned those very critical areas like digital trade, talking about also intellectual property rights. And no doubt these are very, very important parts of this trade pact as we move along. As we move into the second phase, though, what's the stance of the Secretariat on how we should get along in these areas?
Well, we think that Africa has a lot to offer for China, for Chinese investors in particular. I mentioned investments in productive sectors, in manufacturing. China has been able, in less than one generation, lifted over 500 million people out of poverty, primarily through industrial development and export-led trade. And so we have some lessons to observe from the experience of China, particularly from the point of view of human development and the point of view of poverty eradication, how trade can be an instrument for poverty eradication. On the other hand, we also as a continent have quite a lot to offer for China. To China rather. We have a market of 1.3 billion people with a combined GDP that by the year 2035 is estimated to be close to 7 trillion United States dollars. And so Africa is a significant market that is fast growing, notwithstanding the effect of COVID-19. Our continent is fast growing, is dynamic. And by the year 2050, we will have the youngest population in the world. And so all of these positive indices of a future market is what China is looking at for positioning herself for further investment on the African continent. And so we look forward to working with China within the context of the memorandum of understanding that we have signed for investment in productive sectors of our economy, and particularly in digital trade as we entered the phase of the fourth industrial revolution. So it is a mutually beneficial cooperation arrangement that we want to see between ourselves and the government and the peoples of China.
All right, now away from China, let's bring things back home, because I remember the last time we spoke, one of the areas of concern you mentioned then was the areas of customs in terms of their capacity and their procedures. Are we getting any headway in that regard?
We are making progress. As a matter of fact, we identified the Abidjan, where I am today, the Abidjan-Lagos corridor as a corridor that more can be done in order to make sure that it is regionally and continentally competitive. You will know that to transit goods from Abidjan to Lagos by road, it can take between 10 and 12 days, a distance of just over 1,000 kilometers. And so this is the competitiveness of our trade corridors. Is very, very important that we enhance the competitiveness of these trade corridors, because it is through these trade corridors that we will be able to boost intra-Africa trade. And so in September, on the 17th of September, we convened ministers of trade and we convened heads of customs authorities in Lomé, in Togo, where we designed an action plan, concrete steps that we have to take to address the importance of, to address the issue of competitiveness of this trade corridor. We have been approached by other trade corridors on the continent to work with them to enhance their competitiveness from the point of view of trade facilitation, transit of goods, customs procedures, harmonizations. And of course, as I mentioned in the last discussion that you and I had, we are not starting from scratch. We know that there are parts of the continent that have been successful in dealing with the issues of competitiveness on the back of customs procedures. If you take, for example, the fact that East Africa, it now from the port of Mombasa to Kampala, it now takes between 2 to 3 days to transit goods. And this was reduced from a period of 10 days, has been reduced to 2 to 3 days, largely because of private sector investment, deployment of digital technologies, soft infrastructure, hard infrastructure, working together with customs authorities. And so we are making progress. We have met with customs authorities 4 times this year alone, with heads of customs authorities here in Accra, to underscore the importance of a collaboration and to get our customs authorities to understand and accept their responsibility, which they do, by the way, that this agreement will not succeed if we don't work with customs authorities, if we don't modernize our systems. For example, we are now, as a secretariat, at advanced stages of discussing with potential players a digital platform for harmonized customs procedures. For a certificate of origin to be issued manually, it can take up to 15 days. We should be able to do that instantaneously using digital platforms. We should be able to interconnect customs authorities across the continent onto a single digital platform so to ensure efficiency of transit of goods, to ensure trade facilitation, and more importantly, to be able to track and to have a reliable source of data about percentages and the amount of trade that is taking place on the African continent. Without a digital interoperable system, it's very, very difficult to do all of these things that I have been talking about. And so these are some of the priorities that we have identified because we know that we need to move beyond an ordinary or a traditional trade agreement, and that we have to deploy innovative technologies to make sure that this agreement does indeed make the difference that we want it to make a difference.
All right, now talking about making the difference, now there's the other area I want to also bring up here, which is the adjustment facility. And I understand you're working with some partners to get this going. You know, I'm trying to understand what shape this will take when it is ready, and what has been the feedback from the private sector and government.
Governments have received the adjustment facility operationalization of it very, very well. We now are at the last stages, at the last stages of negotiating with AfCFTA the operations of the facility. The AfCFTA Secretariat will own the facility. We are, of course, not fund managers. We don't have expertise in that, but AfCFTA will be the fund manager. They have mobilized $1 billion to ensure that the facility has a good start. They are able to mobilize, that is to say, we will, AfCFTA has committed to mobilize up to $10 billion. And we hope that together we will embark on a mobilization, on a resource mobilization strategy, bringing in our commercial banks in Africa, as well as African development finance institutions, because we know that as countries reduce and eliminate tariffs, that they will lose revenue. And so we have to find a way of, in the short term, find a way of offsetting those revenue losses. And this is where the adjustment facility is so critical. But it's not going to be, as I've said before, it's not going to be budget support for countries to access. It is intended to be productive sector support. So if you determine that your textiles and clothing sector has suffered as a result of an import surge of textiles and clothing from another part of the AfCFTA, you will now be able to access. The fund, so that you can improve whether you require capital investment in capital machinery. There are various interventions that the fund will be able to make. It will be in three components. There will be a component of governments who will be able to, that is to say, members of the African Union, who will contribute to the fund, the general fund. There will be a credit fund. This is where we will mobilize our commercial banks so that they invest in the credit pillar of the fund. My apologies. We'll invest in the credit pillar. There will then be a pillar for international donors that can, such as UN and the others, whom we will encourage to make resources available. But I expect that as a takeoff, the credit fund is where we will see the most activity, because that is that's where AfCFTA is directing in the short term the bulk of the $1 billion that has already been mobilized now. But I will encourage our banks, our commercial banks. This has got to be an African endeavor. We don't want to go to the World Bank. We don't want to go to international donors to advance our own economic activity. We have to rely on ourselves as Africans. And to the extent that commercial banks in Africa are able to make resources available, particularly for the credit fund, invest in the credit fund, where they will see their returns, certainly that is what we should do as Africans.
All right, now let's get into one of the other areas that is still yet to be completed here, which is the rules of origin. And I'm trying to understand the progress that we have so far. And the last time we spoke, you also mentioned some three key areas: clothing and textiles, sugar, and automobiles. I'd like to understand what we're seeing, what progress we're seeing, especially in those areas.
We're making slow progress in those areas, in automobiles, in sugar, textiles, and clothing. And the reason the progress is slow is simply because if you look at textiles and clothing and the auto sector, these are some of the drivers of Africa's economy in many parts of the continent. In the automotive sector, 2 out of 3 jobs are actually in the components that are part of the value chain, not directly on the assembly line. Similarly, in the area of textiles and clothing, a lot of jobs rely in the textiles and clothing sector throughout the African continent. And therefore, we have to be very, very careful. We have to be extremely careful about the types of rules of origin or local content requirements that we agree to, because that has a direct impact on existing jobs, but also has a direct impact on the ability for us to create jobs going forward as a continent. And so I'm not worried that we are still negotiating rules of origin on textiles and clothing, the auto sector, and as well as sugar. In the auto sector, for example, part of the challenge is we have countries, Morocco, Kenya, South Africa, these are countries that have a relatively advanced auto sector. But the challenge is, how do we get those other countries that are new to the sector, who have national automotive development strategies, but today are not as advanced as Morocco or South Africa? We have to design our rules of origin in such a way that we bring these countries also onto the value chain. If we are talking about components, if we have a copper manufacturing in Zambia, how do we get Zambia to be part of that value chain? If we're talking about leather seats, how do we get processed leather to be part of the value chain, processed leather from Ethiopia to be part of the value chain? So it's a very, very complex negotiation, and so it should. And we should be very deliberate about it, because we are talking about the future of the continent from an industrialization point of view. What I would say is this, that actually out of about 7,500 products, we have reached agreement on 86.7%. And so we've made significant progress in terms of rules of origin. From out of this 86.7%, we are now in a position to trade on all of those products under the same rule of origin, which is something that we did not have before as a continent. So think about it. 5 years ago or 6 years ago, East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, we had different rules of origin for the same product. And this is what in part constrained Africa's competitiveness from an investment outlook point of view. Now that on 86.7% of all of those products, we have the same rule of origin, we are positioning our continent in 20, 30 to 40 years' time for deeper industrialization and, of course, for investment competitiveness. So we will solve eventually the autos, rules of origin, the sugar, as well as the textiles and clothing.
All right, now before I let you go, just two key things that I want to get from you. First is getting some timeline on where we can expect some data on trading activity, and to get that clearer picture on the depth of market penetration we're going to be seeing of trade across the continent. And then finally, also the timeline on where we can expect the appointment of that Trade and Industrial Development Advisory Council to advance industrialization, like you rightly put.
Well, usually it takes a year, 2 years for customs data to provide a picture of trade flows. And so now we're talking about 41 countries. It usually takes about 1 to 2 years for a single country. Now that we're talking about 41 countries, it may take us longer than 1 to 2 years to have an assessment of trade flows that are enabled by the agreement. That is why we have to urgently deploy these digital technologies, which will enable faster tracking of trade flows. So I'm hoping that by the end of next year, we will have a digital platform that will enable us to track some of the trade flows. But it also will depend on national customs authorities, because the data that we will get as a secretariat on trade flows will come from the customs authorities, either national customs authorities or customs unions such as SACU, ECOWAS, East African Community, and so on. So it will have to be a joint collaboration, between the Secretariat and the national or regional customs union. But I must stress that it's not a quick exercise to track trade flows. It takes time, but with digital technologies, I expect that we will move quicker than the normal time. In the meeting that of African Ministers of Trade that we convened in Accra last month, I reported to them, as you've just said, that I will appoint a Trade and Industrial Advisory Council. implementation of a trade agreement of this magnitude will require counsel from some of the wisest minds of our continent. And in the brainstorming session that we convened a few months ago, in this group were some outstanding Africans, former ministers of trade, economists, trade economists, policymakers, academics, all of them very, very interested to make a contribution, an intellectual contribution to ensuring that we implement this trade agreement as fast as possible to see the benefits. And so early next year, this advisory council will convene and will start in earnest to work with the Secretariat to provide the highest possible level of counsel based on experience of all of these outstanding Africans, based on their experience in the various areas that they've been in, either in the private sector, public sector, or academia.
All right, then. Thank you so much. Funny how time flies. Thank you so much for the time. As always, I've been speaking to the Wamkele Mene, the Secretary General of the Africa Secretary of the AfCFTA Secretariat. And thanks so much for joining this broadcast as well. I'm sure you got a thing or two from the discussion about plans to deepen intra-Africa trade. I'm Kenneth Igbomo. Enjoy the rest of your day.